So today we're going to talk about my Bruiser type build. I spent a whole week trying to refine this build, so basically since the game was released. And so today, I can finally talk about the things that you need to know so that you can replicate this type of build. Starting things off, let's actually talk about the weapon and what makes this build so good. The weapon that we're gonna be using is the one-handed sword, and the reason for that is because there's actually a rune that is very powerful, and that rune is none other than Spin. I would consider this to be one of the best runes in the game because it actually provides a lot considering that this is a very simple ability. Spin is a double hit ability that can combo into itself, and that is really good because you're able to stagger the enemies even faster, and you can also counter the enemies with shields because of how fast you can hit. Another good thing about this is that you can basically stun lock the small to medium sized enemies because every hit from this rune actually has really good knockback. And when you're up against bigger bosses, this can actually stagger the enemies even faster simply because of the insane attack speed on this rune. You can get this rune by simply getting the blood rusted sword from the blacksmith and then going to Eleanor to extract the rune. So you're basically spending 90 copper for a broken ability. Technically, you can have this rune on any one-handed weapon, but I still recommend using the one-handed sword because for one, it has one of the better attack speeds for the one-handed weapons, and this is also one of the easiest weapons to roll for. All you have to do is to keep buying the blood rusted sword from the blacksmith and then enchanting the weapon to get the right substats. As for the armor pieces, I actually opted for a heavy setup because I wanted to have a decent amount of protection so that I'm not getting one shot by the bosses. I'm using the Eversoul Knight set from the blacksmith, and the same reason as the weapon, I went for this one because it's a lot easier to roll for compared to getting armor from the enemy drops. Moving on, let's actually talk about the substats and specifically which ones you would want to go for. So for this build, the main thing that you would want to focus on is focus. Focus, or the mana system in this game, is actually broken, and that is because of the focus gain stat. Focus gain is obviously going to increase the amount of focus you gain, and this is what we're going to use to skyrocket the damage and mobility for this build. Gain focus on damage dealt is a must-have on your weapon because this is how you're able to use spin attack consistently. I recommend getting around 8% so that you don't have to use chip topaz on your gem slot because having a bloodstone gem is going to be infinitely better. Focus on damage dealt is the only must-have for your weapon, and then you can pretty much go with whatever stat that you seem fit for the other ones. One thing though is that you mainly want to focus on the damage-oriented substats because this build has its own defensive mechanic that I'll be showing you later in this video. As for the rest of your equipment, the main substats that you're looking for are focus gain increase and additional focus. There are also other substats that are essential to this build, so things like armor, healing effect, and maybe even weight decrease. But those can be optimized and balanced out by gem slots, so I recommend hitting the certain values on your focus and focus gain first before you go ahead and fish for the other substats. Moving on, let's actually talk about the rings and which ones you should have. The only must-have ring for this build is actually the Band of Calmness. It's going to give you a ton of focus and a good amount of focus gain, so that means that you don't have to spend a single stat on focus. And as for the other ones, you can go for the Fierce Ring for additional armor and damage, but you can also go for the additional Rune Damage Ring because the majority of your damage is going to come from spin. You can use any combination of damage-oriented rings, but you have to make sure that you have the Band of Calmness and you're not using something that decreases your focus. You can be flexible when it comes to where you have your substats, but there are just some breaking points that you need to reach so that you basically have infinite focus when using spin. I recommend getting at least 200 focus and around 60% focus gain. Try not to go past 300 focus on this build because I find that 200 is more than enough, and so any extra focus lines is going to be a waste. After you hit those values, you can go for any substat that you want, preferably additional armor, healing effect, and maybe even weight decrease. Moving on to the other stats, the majority of your points are going to be on strength. You might have to put a couple of points onto other stats like faith or dexterity, but that is only if you want to equip other items that require those stats. The only other stats that you have to worry about are health and equip load, but these are going to be based on your preference and also on the substats that you got. You don't have to put any stats on stamina and focus because we're not really going to block or parry a lot of times using this build, and you're also not going to roll using this build because instead what you can do is you can put blink on your weapon. I'm gonna be talking about that in a later section, but I just wanted to let you know that you don't need to put any stats on stamina or focus. One thing that I also want to mention is that I'm using a heavy shield, but instead I actually recommend using a lighter shield like the kite shield or the round shield. I would have needed less points on equip load if I used a lighter shield, but if you really wanted to, I guess you can still get away with using a great shield if you happen to get a good roll of weight decrease, and maybe if you put a feather on your shield. Moving on to the gems, I'm running bloodstone on my weapon for health on kill, shield emblems on my helmet, shield, and gloves for additional armor, topaz on my body armor for additional focus, and then another topaz on my pants for focus refund. So looking at my stats, I have 105 HP, 50 stamina, 30 stamina gain, 224 focus, 70% focus gain, and then 824 armor. You can use these numbers as a reference for how you would want to distribute the stats and different substats on your gear, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be based on your preference, because for some people, they might not need 105 HP because they can dodge like a god, so they can put the rest of the points on strength or whatever. So just estimate yourself and set up this build in the way that you would want to play. And before we actually move on to the showcase where I go up against the final boss, I first want to talk about the weapons that I'm using for this build. As you can see, I have two weapons and both of them are one-handed swords. And the reason for that is because I'm just a really big fan of the sword weapon in general, not only because of the aesthetic, but also because of the attack speed. I already mentioned the benefits of using the sword earlier in this video, but another thing that's actually really good about this is that compared to the legendary weapons like this one, I actually prefer using the purple sword or even the blue ones, because you're able to add more runes on these types of weapons. And so as you can see, I have spin, which naturally comes with the blood rusted sword, and then I added another rune, which is the blink. Blink is really good because in my opinion, that is one of the most impactful abilities in the game. Literally any class setup can benefit from this rune, because blink is basically going to let you reposition as many times as you want as long as you have focus. And another good thing about this is that after you use spin, you can actually immediately use blink. Let's say you're trying to attack a boss, then you hit spin, boom, you can actually instantly teleport back. So boom, boom. And the coverage from blink is actually insane, so I highly recommend having this on at least one weapon on any class that you're running. As for the second weapon, you can see that I'm using this legendary weapon, which is the Falstad Fury, but the only reason I'm using this is that I was actually testing out if triple swipe is going to be viable for this class. But it turns out it's not, because it will cost you 100 focus just to use it once, and when you compare it to spin, which is 2 hits, that only costs 50 focus, then it's basically a no-brainer. But if you want to run a second weapon, I actually recommend using a secondary supportive weapon. And what I mean by that is that you're basically just getting any common weapon and then slotting in different supportive runes to give you more buffs. With that being said, we're gonna be moving on to the showcase, but if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to put it down in the comments below. And as always, if you found this video useful, definitely make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.